Marx himself was a complex figure. The early Marx, so you read the philosophical manuscripts and so on, this is coming straight out of the French and German Romanticism. So the kinds of ideas you find expressed in Humboldt and in the more libertarian side of Rousseau himself was very split. But if you take the libertarian part of Rousseau, the Second Discourse on Inequality and Humboldt and so on, all of this that's the background in which Marx grew up. And if you read the philosophical and manuscripts of the early period, they're immersed in this. So his theory of alienation comes out of this. Coerced labor is alienating and counter to human nature precisely for these reasons, for the Humboldtian reasons. When you get to the later Marx, it's sort of like a scholarly debate about whether he changed his mind or just started talking about other things. But anyway, you don't find it any longer. And by that time, Marxism does become, exactly as you say, very detrimental to this. So you get this idea, which you do find in Marx, but he couldn't have believed it, that human nature is just a historical product. And people are just malleable. They're made what their culture turns them into. You get this even in people like Gramsci, who was one of the more libertarian Marxists. But this idea that humans are simply formed by the environment and they are nothing but clay, passive clay in the hands of their molders, that's an idea which is very attractive to radical intellectuals because they think they're going to be the molders, of course, and that leads right to the Leninist version of Marxism. And it does become a kind of orthodoxy. And the earlier views are either forgotten or marginalized, although they're certainly there in Marx, and they certainly are in the tradition that he came from.
There's a lot to be learned from Marx. What? Well, for example, what he wrote about a Russian peasant society, which is not known. That was pretty interesting. But his analysis of the basic character of kind of an abstract form of capitalism, which is his main work, that's pretty enlightening, I think. It doesn't describe actual societies. It's quite abstract, as he insisted. But there are ideas there that can be applied, could be applied then, still can be applied very effectively to the nature of capitalist society. For example, to things like the environmental crisis, which Marx and Engels wrote about in their terms. There's plenty there to learn from. He was also a great reporter. I mean, his commentary on ongoing events in Europe and India and elsewhere is extremely revealing. He was a very penetrating analyst of social systems.
I, like I'm sure many other people who are here tonight, are deeply indebted to your work. It's been absolutely essential in helping us cut through the kind of garbage that we're faced with every day when we try to figure out what's going on in the world. But I think there's also, if I can continue, I think there is also a problem in the analysis that I've seen in your works and that you presented tonight, in the sense that I think we can tend to lose the forest for the trees, that you present so many, astonishing details about what is wrong with the system and about what is wrong with the media, that we can tend to lose sight of what I think the really key question is, which is why is this control necessary in the first place? And I would submit at least that I think it's because there's I got a minute and a half, I swear to God it's no longer. It's because there's antagonistic interests involved. They didn't talk about milkmaids and dairy maids and spinsters and laborers in the 17th century for no reason. It was because they were the working class. And what we see today in this country, I think, is quite frankly, let's speak bluntly, a ruling class which tries to control a working class population. And that's what it's about, is holding on to that power. If that's the case, then it seems like to me the question that we face is how to organize to change that system, to challenge capitalism. And I think in that effort, you do a disservice to your listeners and to the people who respect your work when you equate Lenin with Stalinism as blithely as you did tonight. I say that, and I think it's also important to point out that that is an unquestioned assumption and also an easy applause getter we saw that you share with the mainstream media. And I think if it were actually that simple, the horrific kinds of measures that even bourgeois historians describe as a counter-revolution under Stalin would not have been necessary if they were all the same to begin with. Now, in short, to sum up, the situation that you have outlined tonight, I think, is extremely serious, and I think it's important that we all take it seriously. What we're talking about is literally the fate of millions of lives around the world, particularly in the international politics that you described. That being the case, then I think we need a full and a serious and a fair discussion of various different alternatives, not just talking about the horrors of capitalism, but actually how to change it to end this stuff once and for all.
Well, I think you made, yeah. I think, well, there's several questions there. One is about the discussion of the United States, and I think what I said is approximately what you said, except I didn't use some of that rhetoric. Which I don't think is particularly helpful, to tell you the truth, either analytically or to understand or whatever, but it's the same picture. John Jay had it straight. The people who own the country ought to govern it, and the people who own the country have basically now are a network of corporations and conglomerates and banks and so on. They ought to govern it, and the way they do it is by the methods we've described. Now, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I didn't happen to talk about it tonight, but I've written about this topic. I haven't just made the charge. I've written about it and explained why I think it's true. And it doesn't bother me if I happen to agree with the mainstream media on this. Trotsky, to pick somebody who you remember, once he was charged in the 1930s with agreeing with the fascists in his condemnation of the Soviet Union. And he pointed out that his critique was to be true. He wasn't going to abandon it if somebody else happened to say it for different reasons. So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism. The idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now, that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1917. Now, when Lenin came back to Russia in April 1917, he took a different line, quite a different line from the one he'd had in the past. You take a look at Lenin's work, it shifted character in April 17. In April 1917, it became kind of libertarian. That's when he came out with the April Theses, and that's when he wrote State and Democracy. It came out a year later, but that's when it was written. And these were State and Revolution. These were basically libertarian works. They were very much more in the mainstream of sort of left libertarian socialism, from sort of this range that goes from anarchism over to left Marxism of the Pannekoek-Luxemburg variety. And he talked about Soviets and the need for a workers' organization and so on. And in fact, came really closer to what the essence of socialism was always understood to be. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. That's where you begin with. Then you go on to other things. But the beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution if you want to call it that. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky after Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. He knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the
people wanted to hear. It's just like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it, meaning believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. In any event, whatever your interpretation is, when he took power, he reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production. The Soviets and the factory councils were instruments of workers' control. And same, you could say they're defective instruments, they worked out better and so on, yeah, no doubt. But they were the instruments that had been developed in the course of popular struggle to implement basically workers' control, and those were the first things to go. By early 1918, it's still really before the Civil War set in, Lenin's view was pretty clearly expressed. It was the view that both he and Trotsky took the position that what you need is what Trotsky called a labor army, which is submissive to the control of a single leader. He said modern progress and development and socialism requires that the mass of the population subordinate themselves to a single leader in a disciplined workforce. Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. In fact, it's the exact opposite of it, and was criticized for that by in a spirit of some solidarity, because the revolutionary forces were still operative. He was criticized for that by people like Rosa Luxemburg and by Pannekoek and Gorter and the other mainstream sort of left Marxists, and I think they were right. It seems to me that, and then it just goes on from there. I mean, Lenin reconstructed the czarist systems of oppression often more efficiently, Cheka, KGB, and other techniques of control and oppression. I think from that point on, there was nothing remotely like socialism in the Soviet Union. I think it was, in fact, in my view, it was a precursor of later forms of totalitarianism. Now, you could, that's what I think happened, and I think that's what you discover if you look at the facts. Now, why is it called socialism? Well, I think I think that's complicated, and we should look at it. The Soviet Union calls it socialism. And after they took control they did take control pretty soon of most of the international socialist movement, because primarily of the prestige of having created something sort of socialism. Incidentally, just a side remark, Lenin remained, despite it all, a sort of an orthodox Marxist in many respects. And as an orthodox Marxist, he didn't believe that it was possible to have socialism in the Soviet Union. This was supposed to be up to his death, or shortly before his death, when he was still writing, speaking lucidly. He kept the view that the Soviet revolution was a holding action. They would just kind of hold things in place until the real revolution took place in Germany, because the revolution, according to Marxist doctrine, was going to take place in the most advanced sector of modern industrial capitalism, for all the reasons that you read about in Marx. That's where the revolution had to take place. Obviously, that wasn't the Soviet Union, so there couldn't be socialism there. It was just some kind of holding action. And that presumably gave some sort of justification for eliminating the socialist institutions. I don't think it's a real justification, but probably that was the internal justification. And again, in taking that view, he was in accord with the mainstream Marxist tradition. Well, after that comes the view that all of this is socialism. And why should the communist parties take that view? I think the reason is because they wanted to exploit the moral force of socialism, which was quite real. It's kind of hard to remember that today, but at that time it was very real. This was regarded as a progressive moral force, and by associating their own destruction of socialism with the aura of socialism, they hoped to gain credit in the working classes and other progressive sectors. Now, the West also identified that with socialism, and they did it for the opposite reason. They wanted to associate socialism with the brutality of the Russian state that undermined socialism. So what you had is that the two major world propaganda agencies, for their own and quite different reasons, were claiming that this is socialism, that this destruction of socialism is socialism. And it's very hard to break out of the control of the world's two major propaganda agencies when they agree. They agreed for different reasons, but They basically agreed, and that then became doctrine and dogma. Well, I think people should ask whether that's true. Take a look back and see whether the moves that Lenin took and that Trotsky supported him in taking and that they both advocated had anything to do with socialism as it was understood by, say, in the Marxist tradition or in the left libertarian tradition. And I think the answer that you'll discover when you look at that is that they didn't. In fact, this was a destruction of socialist institutions. Well, you know, this may be true or it may be false, but if it's true, and I think the evidence pretty strongly supports it, then I don't see any reason why we shouldn't express that fact. And I certainly don't think that we should be deterred in expressing this fact if other people who's, you know, fascists or whatever, happen to condemn the Soviet Union, just for the same reasons that Trotsky mentioned in the 1930s.
In the mid-70s, many people in the West thought that Marxism had a reasonable case to argue. But in the mid-1980s, many of them no longer considered that it had. What exactly happened? Did it turn out that it was all just a big joke?
Well, I think what happened is what you wrote up before. Marxism was associated with the Soviet Union and Maoist China and other so-called communist systems. But, you know, Marx would have turned over in his grave to see what they were doing. They were radically anti-Marxist, radically. But as long, like take, say, the way the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, decided they had to drive the backward peasantry to industrialization by force in order to lead ultimately to a socialist society. In the last 20 or 30 years of his life, Marx was working on peasant society in Russia. There were the Narodniks, you know, the urban intellectuals went out to the countryside to collect information, to figure out how the peasants are living, and so on and so forth, try to assist them in things. And they collected tons of data. And Marx was just poring over the data. And he became convinced that there's real revolutionary potential in peasant society, peasant communes, peasant cooperative tradition, and so on. The urban socialists, both the Bolsheviks and the Social Democrats, literally suppressed all that work. It was just too inconsistent with their own class interests of, you know, controlling social movements. So that was gone. And the same is true across the board. I mean, I'm not, again, kind of like Adam Smith, you can't worship Marx, but he had things to say. And what he had to say, what he believed, was utterly inconsistent with what are called the communist socialist movements. Even more the communist than the social democratic ones. After all, he believed that in England, you know, that's the social democratic society of his day, that there could be a parliamentary road to communism. But, you know, because there was enough participation of the public in decisions. But in any event, once you associate Marx with Russia, and it's clear that Russia is becoming a disaster, as was becoming clear by the 80s, well, of course, then you have to say, let's give up Marx. And I think that's essentially what happened.
Thank you.
The Russian system was finally collapsing. I was asked by a leftist journal to write an article on, you know, what does it mean when socialism collapses? And I wrote an article. I said, this is a small victory for socialism if this goes. Then I explained why. They refused to publish it. It finally appeared in an anarchist journal in Montreal. But I actually wrote something like that for The Nation in a symposium they had. I don't think anybody understood a word of what I was saying. I mean, even the people who were strong anti-Stalinists and so on. But I think that's true. Now, you know, out of the Marxist movement, there came another strain. People like well-known people, Anton Pannekoek, head of the Second International Educational System, Karl Korsch, you know, others later here like Paul Maddock, strict Marxists, but they had a different position. They're very opposed to Bolshevism. In fact, Lenin had a famous pamphlet about them. They called the ultra-left infantile something or other. That was kind of left, you know, kind of left-wing Marxism. Wasn't very far from anarcho-syndicalism. In fact, there's a pretty close relation. A lot of these people were very much in favor of the Spanish Revolution, anarchist revolution. But so there was that strain. They wanted workers' control in factories, elimination of the party hierarchy, very anti-Leninist. But that was, although that was some of the leading figures in the Marxist movement, that was dispiriting. I mean, who's read Panico? But you have. Okay, who else? But in fact, the stuff didn't even reach the West until the 1950s. But and then there was, of course, the whole, left libertarian movements, anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, all sorts of other people. But that didn't become socialism. Well, socialism became Lenin, or else social democracy, a German social democracy, which was kind of reformist, parliamentary social democracy, which did do things for workers' rights and women's rights and so on. So, but it's within the framework of state capitalist democracy. So that was socialism. But the real socialist movement was pretty much crushed. We should recognize what I think is true. I've written about it plenty myself, that the Bolshevik Revolution, so-called revolution, it was really a coup, was really a counter-revolution, which placed state power in the hands of a highly authoritarian, anti-socialist group, which within a couple of months had destroyed the factory councils, had destroyed the Soviets, had dismissed the Constituent Assembly because they knew they were going to lose, and had eliminated every popular movement, and had done exactly what Trotsky said, turned the country into a labor army under the control of the maximal leader. That was mid-1918. I mean, since then, there hasn't been a shred of socialism in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, they called it socialism, but they also called it democracy. They were people's democracies, the purest form of democracy. They were socialism. The left, the West, the big propaganda system in the world, of course, just laughed at the democracy part, but it loved the socialism part, because that's a way to defame socialism. So if you think that the fall of the Soviet Union is a blow to socialism, you ought to also think on the same grounds that it's a blow to democracy. After all, they call themselves democracies too, so why isn't it a blow to democracy? Makes as much sense. It's only when it gets filtered through the Western propaganda system that it's not a blow to democracy, but it is a blow to socialism. But there's absolutely no reason to play that game, whether you play it in Dissent or in The Nation or on the right or anywhere else. Expose it for the fraud that it is.
His comment that the ideology was flawed.
What ideology? The ideology of totalitarianism? Yeah, it's deeply flawed. I mean, they were the initial modern totalitarians. It's not, it has nothing to do with socialism. They destroyed socialism within weeks. They didn't wait. By 1918, it was finished. And they knew it, like it's not a secret. They knew it. I mean, in fact, Lenin, as soon as he sort of got grips of things, after he said, he moved to what he called state capitalism, which is what it was. It had nothing to do with socialism. Socialism, I mean, you can argue about there's no point arguing what the word means, but what it always meant at the core was that producers take control of production. Working people take control of production, what's sometimes called industrial democracy. That was the absolute core of it. Well, there was more socialism in Germany, in Western Europe, than there was in Russia. Russia's about the most anti-socialist place you can imagine since 1918. Had wage labor, had super exploitation, had no element of workers' control or involvement or participation. And that's just pure, what's it got to do with socialism? It's the exact opposite on every point. As I say, the West liked to call that socialism while laughing at the fact that they called themselves Democrats. But that's for purely propaganda reasons. I mean, unless you're committed to being part of the Western propaganda system, there's nothing to say about that issue of dissent except to laugh.
Now, as far as socialism is concerned, that term has been so evacuated of content over the last century that it's hard even to use. I mean, the Soviet Union, for example, was called a socialist society, and it was called that by the two major propaganda operations in the world, the US, the Western one, and the Soviet one. They both called it socialism for opposite reasons. The West called it socialism in order to defame socialism. by associating it with this miserable tyranny. The Soviet Union called it socialism in order to gain whatever, to benefit from the moral appeal that true socialism had among large parts of the general world population. But this was about as remote from socialism as you can imagine. I mean, the core notion of at least traditional socialism is that what you mentioned, that working people have to be in control of production and communities have to be in control of their own lives and so on. And you know, this goes, the Soviet Union was the exact opposite of that. Working people had no control over anything. They were virtual slaves. And the collapse of the Soviet Union is in fact a small victory for socialism, in my opinion. It eliminated one of the major barriers to it and should have been recognized as such. But the term has been, as I said, become so meaningless that it's hard even to use. If we use it in the traditional sense, which you brought up, that goes straight back in American history. You read the working class press in the mid-19th century, you know, press published by artisans and what were called factory girls, young women from the farms working in the textile mills in eastern Massachusetts, which was the center of beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Their press was calling for, they said their theme was that those who work in the mills ought to own them. Wage labor, which was called wage slavery, was regarded by most Americans as not very different from slavery. Even the Republican Party regarded wage labor as just at best a preliminary to free labor, but intolerable because it's a kind of servitude. A large part of the northern population fighting the Civil War was fighting under that banner. This goes straight through the 20th century, the idea that people should be in control of their own destinies and lives, including the institutions in which they work, the communities in which they live, and so on. Call it what name you want, but that's traditional socialism. And there are today attempts to describe a kind of a detailed vision of the future based on these notions. The most extensive and detailed one I know is by Michael Albert at ZNet, which you mentioned. It's participatory economics, and there are other such proposals. But I think this is deeply ingrained in people's understanding and consciousness and barely below the surface. In fact, it's a call for essentially extension of democracy to the industrial sphere and to communities as well. We should also bear in mind that the leading American social philosopher, John Dewey, who's as mainstream as apple pie, his main work was concentrated on democracy. He pointed out over and over again that as long as we have what he called industrial feudalism, that is a tyrannical control, private power controlling production commerce, democracy will be very limited. We have to move to what he called industrial democracy if we hope to have significant democracy. As for politics, his position was that until that happens, politics will be the shadow cast over society by big business. And I think most of the population recognizes that and accepts it.